really great experiences, and hopefully if you'll have an opportunity to catch up with the things you might have missed. Hello, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here. My name is Jhenah Telyndru. I am the founder of the Sisterhood of Avalon, which was founded in 1995. I'm an author. I've written several books about Avalon with Llewellyn. I've written a couple of books on Welsh goddesses, including my new book. And this is just my momentary, this just came out 2 weeks ago on June 8th. So I'm really excited for that to be out into the world. I am a bit of a history academic wonk. I have a master's degree in Celtic studies from the University of Wales. And so it's been really fantastic to be able to study a lot of these topics from an academic formal perspective, and then to see the ways in which that informs practice. And one of the things I think that, oh no, can you not hear me? Am I still here? Try refreshing. Hello, can you see me again? I am here. Okay, but now my face is really big and we don't want that. So let me get my my slides back up. Hopefully, quick order. Okay, very good. Fantastic. So I think one of the things that my degree program taught me that really expanded my practice is being able to learn how to read myth in a particular way, to be able to extract information from it. And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind when we're exploring the myths of Avalon is that stories don't have to literally have happened for what they contain to be true. There are pieces of information, unconscious histories, cultural pieces that are carried on, embedded in story. And so we can learn a lot from stories, even if they're stories that are storytelling or myths or legends or even novels. There are pieces of culture embedded. And so when people have come up to me, and they have many times over the last few years, last 3 decades, how do you follow a spiritual path that has as its center what is a literary place? Avalon. Was it a real place? How do we know what we know about it? And so that's what we're going to talk about today in exploring the myths of Avalon, talking about this cultural piece that has come to us down what I like to call the stream of tradition. And I think the most enduring image that we have of Avalon is that it is the place to which Arthur is taken at the end of his life after the Battle of Camlan to be healed of his wounds. And so there's that iconic, casting of the sword into the lake, the arrival of the barge, and Arthur being carried in the lap of 3 queens to Avalon for healing, and that he remains there, the once and future king. And so there's so much that's embedded in there. And there's a history of evolution of story that precedes this piece. Here, here's from Tennyson's Idylls of the King, talking about how he's going to Avalon. And it contains the core piece that kind of spans the existence of Avalon in the literary tradition. To the island valley of Avalon, where falls not hail or rain or any snow, nor ever wind blows loudly, but it lies deep meadowed, happy, fair, with orchard lawns and bowery hollows crowned with summer sea, where I will heal me of my grievous wound. So he describes Avalon. And it is a potent piece because the very first mentions of Avalon mirror that directly. So I like to call this the stream of tradition, meaning that there is a source, just like a river, and the Celts held the rivers to be sacred, divine embodiments. They're deities, they're of the river. But the source of the river is always the most sacred part. It's the place where it springs forth from the other world, this bounty, this magical piece. And so it's somewhere in that vast back in time place where Avalon first began meandering. There are pieces, there are streams and currents of things that have informed the Avalon that we have come to know. Our literary inheritance today is informed by over 1,000 years, perhaps even more, of lore, of belief, of understanding, of practice. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, this lineage of symbol, keeping in mind that the Celts, so we assume that there are strands of things, and there are definitely pieces of the Avalonian traditions that have come to us through our Arthurian tradition that have their origins in pre-Christian cultures. And we'll talk about those in a moment. So some of these pieces of the story have been in oral tradition. And oral tradition is living tradition. It changes to reflect. That's why the stream of tradition is such a good metaphor, because it reflects the cultures that it passes through. The landscape is the time frame, is the cultural context. And we see what we need in stories. Myths, legends, lore, they contain things that are relevant to us. They teach us something. They reflect our culture. We see ourselves in it. And when we see ourselves in story, in myth, in symbol, the symbols shift a bit to answer our needs. And so what we have in Avalon is a really rarefied and informed and charged up symbol set, a realm that brings in a bunch of different pieces in the stream of tradition. And I talk about this in terms of the confluence of currents. The themes and motifs are found in history, in myth, and in legend. And there are three that we're going to focus on specifically, maybe not in equal balance, but we only have 30 minutes and it's a lot to talk about. So we're talking about otherworldly islands, Ninefold Sisterhoods, and vessels of sovereignty. There are seeds of each of these motifs in pre-Christian beliefs, such as we imagine them to be, and I'll talk about that in a minute if I can. But because it is a living tradition, once it started getting written down, it was kind of sealed in a time and a place. And we think about the earliest appearance of Avalon in written tradition to be in many ways the most informative. In the early medieval period, a lot of the stories were written down by people who wanted to preserve them. And so our first place where we have seen Avalon mentioned is by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the Historia Regum Britanniae, so the history of the kings of Britain. So this is the early 1100s. And let's talk about him really quickly. He is what we call today a pseudo-historian. Now, for the standards of his time, he was doing great. But from a historian's perspective today, he intermingled a lot of pieces, lore, legend, myth, history. He expanded things in certain ways. He put his own spin on things that we tend to keep away from in historian pieces today, unless it's, explicitly stating that it's opinion pieces. But in many ways, it's a reflection of the bardic traditions. When you look at some of the early bardic poetry, history and lore are side by side. So the two first things that he says about it, the first thing we learn about is that Caliburn, or Caliburnus, he's writing in Latin, by the way, but he's of Norman Welsh descent, was an excellent sword made on the Isle of Avalon. This is an important piece. Caliburn, which eventually is Excalibur, the name shifts, was made on Avalon. Then he says, this is the first place it says it. So right from the beginning, Arthur is wounded. He is taken to Avalon to be healed. Okay, so there's two huge pieces that we have there. A couple of years later, he wrote a long-form poem called the Vita Merlini, or the Life of Merlin. And it's a wonderful piece. I encourage you to read it. And this is where we have our another mention. He goes into a lot more details about Avalon. And this is in a dialogue between Mervyn and Taliesin. And he talks about 9 sisters ruling by a pleasing set of laws. That Morgan is the first among them, and she's a healer, and she's an excellent healer. They're learned women. She knows how to use herbs. She knows, and they know how to shape shift, turn into birds to fly where they will. They are learned in mathematics, which we think probably refers to both math as we consider it, and astronomy and astrology. So there's that kind of Cirrus Seer piece, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they were also educated in music. So he names Morgan and her 9 sisters. Her 8 sisters. There are 9 of them altogether. And together they rule this place that is Avalon. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. I am so sorry. This is truly going to be a rushing right through, but I want to give all the pieces. So he describes Avalon as a place, the island of apples, which is what Avalon means. In this, Avalon in the Welsh is the island of apples, apple trees. They call it the Fortunate Isle. Food grows in abundance there. No one has to till the soil. Everyone lives healthily. They have really long lives, and it's a blissful place. It's a paradise, truly. And you're long lived and healthy and happy. So an important piece there, the Fortunate Isle. And then again, he talks about Arthur and his coming to Avalon and how they were guided there by a knowledgeable navigator and are received by Morgan and lain in her golden bed. And she tells them that she will heal Arthur, and his men are so excited, and they leave, and Arthur remains there in Avalon to be healed. So this sets the tone for things to come. Now, the problem with Geoffrey of Monmouth, because he is a pseudo-historian, we don't know where his source is. We don't know what parts of this are of his own creation, what parts of this are a reflection of vernacular tales that are kind of out there at his time period, or if he's putting in some pieces that he knows, because he's a very well-educated man. He would have gotten a medieval education in the classics. And so it's a little bit of both. There are pieces of strands of things that tie into older Celtic tradition. And we know that people who are experts in Geoffrey of Monmouth can point to and know that he's often overlaying and combining his classical education with native sources. And so I can't say so much more about that at the moment, but what's interesting is that the names of the 9 sisters only appear once. They have these, it's felt that he perhaps created these names, that he was asked what they were, he wrote them down, he created them. We don't see them anywhere else. They bear resemblance to other things. They have these watery aspects to them. They look like classical Greek, Roman water deities, some of their names. I can't really get into that at the moment, but that is a whole discussion. But keep that in mind because we will discuss it. Now, this first story of Arthur coming to Avalon is unusual in that it's the only one where his men actually bring him there. But they have a knowledgeable navigator who might be related to Manawydan or Manannán mac Lir, who has an association with the otherworld. And we'll talk about that otherworld connection later. Can't talk about Barthinius right now, unfortunately. But every other one, it is someone from Avalon who comes to retrieve him. It is usually at least 3 queens, but almost always Morgan who is with him. So this Morgan becomes who we know as Morgan le Fay. So we'll see more about her in a moment. I'm going to talk a bit about those 3 currents because we see them reflected in these earliest pieces. As time progresses, the story pretty much remains the same. At the end of his life, Arthur is brought to Avalon. Sometimes he is a lover of Morgan. Later on, she becomes his half-sister. Now, keep in mind, although it's conflated in some modern retellings, Morgan le Fay, is not the mother of Mordred. That is Morgause. So just to separate those 2 out for a moment. But let's talk about the things that we see here. The idea of otherworldly islands is a current that runs through a lot of Celtic traditions from several Celtic lands. And we see them as the islands of the blessed, the fortunate isle. Islands of women appear in Irish tradition. The Imram Bran and the Imram is to the Isle of Women. He's invited there by an apple branch, and islands of apples appear. Emen Ablach. I'm sorry, I'm in the Welsh side of things, and even my Welsh isn't that great, but I can't pronounce the Irish very well, so do please forgive me, I did my best. There are islands of healing, places where heroes would go to be healed. Sometimes islands of the dead. There is one place called, I can't remember them, but it's Donn, D-O-N-N, is it's a waylay station almost for souls between the worlds, because in Celtic traditions, we believe that they believed in reincarnation. And so any souls that go into the other world, usually it's living people, heroes who dare to enter the other world, or who are invited there by fairy lovers and things of that nature. But souls don't go and reside there. It's not like a Hades kind of a thing, or a hell kind of an afterlife. They would come back into cycle again. They'd be reincarnated. So it was just kind of like a way station. But islands of the dead do appear really physically in the actual landscape. In fact, here, this is an image of Bardsey Island in its Entley, which is off the coast of Wales. And it has a lot of the characteristics that we associate with Avalon, that it is an island, that it has a certain apple tree associated with it, that it is an island of the dead. There is a prophecy or a blessing there that those who die on that island or are buried there will go into heaven. There was a religious center there of early monks. So there's a lot about this place, and it's very difficult to get there. It's a very difficult journey. So otherworldly or islands of the dead, the Scilly Islands, also off the coast of Cornwall. Cornwall also fit that description because of the sheer amounts of people. Bardsey is called the island of 10,000 saints for that reason. And in Welsh tradition, we have the island fortresses of Annwn or Annwfn. We don't know if it's one island with several fortresses or one fortress with several names. So it's complicated, but that piece about that journey over water to the other world is key. And this is the thing that tells us Avalon is not someplace that is necessarily in this world. It is an island. It is surrounded by mists. It's in a place of liminality. Water is associated with the other world. That crossing is a characteristic of some early tales from Ireland and Wales and things of that nature to get into the other world. So, it kind of gives a sense of where Avalon resides. I believe Avalon is in the other world. I also believe that there are aspects of Avalon that have come to reside in landscapes that have become associated with them. I'll see if I have time. I might be able to touch upon it in our time here, but we'll see. That's why I've written a 504-page book and on this, because there is a lot of information, believe it or not. There's a lot of things to consider, a lot of cultural aspects. This piece with the Fortunate Isles is just to say that the description that is given here, this is by Isidore of Seville. Geoffrey of Monmouth would have studied him. This is a first kind of encyclopedic compilation of knowledge from Western tradition in his Etymology. It's a multi-volume set. And here he talks about the Fortunate Isles, and it sounds very much like Avalon. So this is the piece where we're like, there is a precedent here, but it is a strong motif because it's not just these pieces that we see here to be created. Again, there is a lot of precedent in myth for these things. Oh my goodness, we only have 10 minutes. And okay, Ninefold Sisterhoods. This is a big piece, and I spent a lot of time researching all of the different ninefolds that show up in Celtic sisterhoods, Celtic traditions. The Galicinae, the Seminitae are islands of priestesses that the Romans wrote about. Now, the Romans also have that kind of thing. Is it lore? Is it legend? But there are two different such settlements. Explicitly, one of them are said to be of 9, but the women who reside in them and the accounts of them are separated by about 200 years. So 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, we have these two different accounts of these women, the Seminitae or the other ones, that they are shapeshifters, they are weather workers, they are augurs and healers, that they are sought out, they're in service to their people, but you have to approach them on their island. And in fact, the Seminitae do not allow men on their islands at all. They would leave the island to be in service to others. So, and the 9 sorceresses of Larthach is an inscription on a lead plaque, a curse plaque that names a group of 9 women. So we have the historical piece. Legends and lore from Celtic lands, there are so many of them. The 9 Maidens of Annwn, the 9 Sisters of Avalon from Geoffrey of Monmouth, 9 Witches of Caerloe, bunches of witches, bunches of maidens, the 9 Corrigan, which is Breton myth, Ruad and the 9 Sisters, that's Irish. And then even outside of the Celtic world, there are the 9 Daughters of Ran, the 9 Mothers of Heimdallar, 9 Giantesses of the Mill. These are from Norse tradition. And of course, the Irish 9 Muses. So what gives with that? Really quickly, these are all cultures of Indo-European. Yes, the number 9 shows up all the time. These are all cultures of Indo-European derivation. And so what I've come to think is that 9 in and of itself, that because we can consider, were there 9 priestesses? Was this a group, a cultural group, a religious group? Were there 9 deity women that would, whose worship kind of traveled across Europe? Or are they part of the Indo-European mother culture? But I think perhaps those are true, but we also have to consider this, that the number 9 had a very specific significance in these cultures. And I did not put the slide in, that 9 represents a wholeness, right? 9 represents a perfection, ultimate. We look at it from numerology today, right? It's the end of a cycle before a new one begins. And so we see not only these religious groups of women, but a lot of different things are grouped in 9. Someone mentioned in the chat about the Norse ninefold cosmology. There are the laws of 9s in the in Welsh law. There are the 9 members of a war band. Usually one is named and the other 8 aren't, which is part of the reason why they think that the 9 Sisters of Avalon, that Morgan was the leader, and that her 8 sisters didn't have name, and that they were created by Geoffrey. So that kind of supports the idea that this is an older belief system, because it's tying into that Celtic piece of the leader and the 9 support. But I think it has to do with the magic of 9, the number of 9. And of course, there's a lot of connections with women especially, and it is associated with magic as well. But 9 is a number of wholeness, a number of completion. So I looked as well at not only at these Ninefold Sisterhoods, but what do we know about these holy women? Were they priestesses? Were the Sisters of Avalon priestesses? Were they goddesses? Were they nature spirits? Priestesses had a lot of different, or holy women, I say as well, because we can look into the Christian period at saints. We can look at different ways that women are intermediaries, even sovereignty figures. They all perform this kind of handful of services. They're in service as a bridge, and they bridge knowledge and ignorance and knowledge. They bridge sobriety and intoxication. They bridge war and peace. They bridge death and life. It is a powerful collection of things that we see in the lore that these holy women, that these sacred women, that these otherworldly women were doing. And oftentimes, whether or not they were in cloisters of 9 women, or they were singular sacred women. So we could talk about some of like Veleda in the Germanic, in Gaul and Germanic areas, where she lives in a high tower, and she was a seeress, and there was an intermediary, men in her family. People wouldn't speak to her directly. So there was a sense of being set apart, the same way that Avalon was set apart. So there are a lot of similarities, not only in the clusters of 9 women, but also in the historical women that we know were these priestesses or holy women, seers, poets, and later on saints and nuns, things of that nature. So we talked about them in terms of being priestesses. We talked about perhaps the idea that they are goddesses. Certainly the 9 Maidens of Annwn hold a very strong resonance with the 9 Muses of Greek tradition. And I talk about that piece with the inspiration. But they could also be, and perhaps became over time, conflated with or evolved into, there are water spirits, Fay, called Morgans and Mari Morgans. And this is in Welsh and in Breton tradition. Morgan means born of the sea, and Mari Morgan means born of the sea, the ocean, to be specific. And so the fact that the first sister is Morgan with an E. Morgan is not a female name in Welsh tradition, so it was very strange that she would have this name. And Morgan eventually became Morgan Le Fay, and she's the one, again, who kind of took precedent. She stepped forward and the other women were behind. We don't hear from them again. But again, if they were these watery figures, these ladies of the lake, these intermediaries between this world and the other worlds, we can look at then there are other stories of ladies of the lake, of the wives of the noon, of lake fairies. Those traditions also have this bridging piece, also seem to have this confluence of connection to the other world. So it gives us other places to look based on that etymology piece. So perhaps they were these intermediary figures, ways of being in relationship with the landscape. So we talked about Morgan Le Fay. Le Fay means the fairy or the fate. Fairies meant something different in those times as they do today. She was a magic user. When we first saw her, she was almost a semi-divine. She was an ally of Arthur. She helped him out. But over time, as the story of Arthur evolved, the story of Avalon evolved, the story of Morgan evolved, and she began to shift, and her role began to change, and she became no more an ally, but an adversary. She was fighting actively against him for some reason. And in many ways, if you study the evolution of Morgan and her characterization in myth, you see that she goes from being this beneficent figure to being this evil sorceress and temptress. She holds all of women's sins, all of the fears of women, all of the fears of magic. So that shifts her perspective. But there may be another thing, and I'm going to try really hard to get through this little part. We know that Arthur received his sword from the Lady of the Lake. There are two swords, but this is Caliburnus, not the sword in the stone. That's a French edition. But when he receives the sword from the hand of the lake, there's a conference of sovereignty, where in the past there was a sexual congress. Certainly a sword being given from the hand of a woman kind of has, it's a metaphor. Let's put it that way. He receives the sword. It empowers him to be king. It's like he receives the blessings of Avalon. And remember, the sword was forged on Avalon. So Avalon has a connection with the conference of sovereignty, which I think is really kind of keen. And you see here that he, again, is receiving Excalibur. And at the end of his life, he tells Sir Bedivere and Griflet first, and then Bedivere takes over later, to cast the sword into the lake, to return that symbol of power to the other world from whence it came. And it took him 3 times to go and do it. And when the knight finally did, he catches it. She catches it in her hand, and it returns to the lake. And that is when he returns to Arthur, the barge of Avalon appears. Another piece here is what is interesting is that Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake sometimes are conflated with each other. They're certainly two magical women, but in later Arthurian tradition, they seem to be at odds with each other, two halves of the same magic. And Morgan tries to bring down Arthur for many reasons. She's challenging him. Some believe that she's challenging his treatment of women. She's challenging his sovereignty, and she tries to install her own king. She tries to take the sword away from him, to take back the sovereignty, which is something a sovereignty goddess could do in older tradition. So she doesn't get the sword back, but she does take back the sheath, which is also a very feminine symbol, that which kept him healed, that which kept him whole. So although he kept the sword, she withdrew some of that magical healing that is always been associated with Avalon and with her. But even when she has been in his worst enemy in stories, she is always one of the women to come to take him on the barge. And that is a really powerful statement there. One of the reasons, I'm going to say this, one of the reasons that Arthur and Avalon one of the reasons probably we remember Avalon is because they became conflated with Arthur. Arthur had a lot of different story traditions attached to him. Avalon is the same. And the thing about Arthur is this: he became a culture hero. Whatever he may have been, a seed of him was historical, just like all of the things we're talking about with Avalon. They're confluences of things that evolve over 1,000 years. But Arthur is the once and future king. He was the Breton hope, and the Breton and the Welsh hope. They believed that Arthur would come to help them in their time of need. And Avalon is what kept him there, kept the sovereignty of the land, that he would return to bring the Britons back to a time of peace, prosperity, and independence. And all of these stories were being written down during a time where Wales and Cornwall and Brittany were constantly under attack and in losing their independence. So all of that to say, woo, whirlwind tour. What does that have to do with us here and now? We've received all of this. I think that the thing about Avalon is the further back you can trace her story, the further you can get into the symbolism, the further you can find the ways in which these ninefolds, these islands, these vessels of sovereignty are connected to each other. And that's sometimes connected with the Holy Grail, but we don't have time to go over that. So here our vessel of sovereignty is the sword, all of the things. But is that we've received this inheritance. It is powerful to us. Myths endure because they have something to teach us. And some of the things I think that it can teach us is about the different ways of being in sacred service. Being a priestess, to me, being in service to the gods can take many different forms. It's not just the the seer or the healer or the ritual facilitator. So there's more to it. That it's there's something about being in sacred community. How do we build that? How do we maintain that? The importance of obtaining sovereignty is key. The nature of hope. Arthur was an inspiration, and Alwyn is such a big piece of this, of all of this. The importance of healing and wholeness. So there's that ninefold. Avalon is an island of healing. The vision of an empowered past for an empowered future. And it teaches us to be in right relationship with ourselves, our community, and our gods. Now, I'm talking about Avalon here almost as if it's only a place that's a symbol, but it's not. It is a living place. It is in existence in the other world. Places like Glastonbury, places like Bardsey Island. These are places that are rich with that energy, beautiful bridges into the other world. We can access Avalon very easily there. But remember, it is a trip over water. And the journey over water can also be seen as the journey through the unconscious, through the psyche, to connect with that collective unconscious, to enter literally the other worlds. And there's so much I can't talk about now, and I'm already done, but I encourage you, if you have an interest in being in relationship with Avalon, in learning more about the ninefolds, learning more about Morgan and the goddesses, from a cultural perspective, there is a rich amount of information that's out there, not just my book, although you can even just look at the bibliography, and all the sources are there. So all of that to say, I do hope, I'm so sorry that this is so quick. I am not a 30-minute woman, but please, I would love to be in connection with you. These are my books. If you go to my link tree, it's my website, it's my social media. I love to connect. I'm a Gemini. I love to connect. I love communication. If you're not connected with me in any of those places, please do. Check out the Sisterhood of Avalon. Check out some of my offerings. And thank you so much for your time. And I know it's gone over, but I'll hang around to answer stuff in the chat if we can. And if you're watching this later on Crowdcast or on YouTube, I'll swing by and see if there are any questions I can answer for you. Thank you so much for all. You knew it. See, she knew it. Libra rising and a Leo moon. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you for Llewellyn for hosting me, and please enjoy the rest of your